Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, not with a jolt, not from a nightmare, just gently, eyes open, mind quiet but awake. The room is dark, the world outside is still, and some part of you feels strangely, perfectly fine. You don't panic, you don't reach for your phone, you just lie there, thinking. Maybe you feel a little restless. Maybe you want to get up and do something. Maybe you just stare at the ceiling and let your thoughts wander. And then, an hour or two later, you drift back to sleep. Here's the thing. If that has ever happened to you, you weren't broken. You weren't suffering from insomnia. You weren't doing something wrong. You were remembering deep in your body, buried beneath layers of modern habit and artificial light and alarm clocks. There is an ancient rhythm, a rhythm that shaped human sleep for thousands and thousands of years, a rhythm that doctors and scientists are only now beginning to understand. And it goes like this: sleep, wake, sleep again. 2 sleeps every night. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't a disorder. This was just how humans slept for most of human history. They called it first sleep and second sleep. And the time in between, that quiet, wakeful hour in the middle of the night, wasn't wasted time. It wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was something else entirely. People used it to think, to pray, to talk to the person lying next to them, to go outside and look at the stars, to write, to make love, to simply exist in the dark in a way that our modern world has almost completely forgotten. And when historians and sleep researchers started digging into this, they found something that genuinely stopped them in their tracks. This wasn't rare. This wasn't a quirk of one culture or one century. References to first sleep and second sleep appear in ancient Roman texts, in medieval European documents, in African oral traditions, in the diaries of farmers and monks and sailors from hundreds of years ago. This was just how humans slept, until very suddenly we stopped. And the question of why we stopped and what we lost when we did, and what that middle-of-the-night wakefulness was actually for, turns out to be one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in the history of the human body. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, let your eyes go soft, because tonight we're going back to bed, the old way. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you are in the world right now. What city? What time it is? I check every single one. There's something wonderful about knowing that someone in Edinburgh and someone in Melbourne and someone in a small town in Ohio are all drifting off together, listening to the same story about how sleep used to work before the modern world rearranged everything. Now, let's begin. The first secret the night ever kept. Before we can understand how humans used to sleep, we need to understand what the night actually was. Not what it is now. Not the thin darkness behind blackout curtains with streetlights bleeding through the edges and your phone screen glowing on the nightstand. The real night. The ancient night. Go back 10,000 years. Go back 50,000. Go back to a world with no electricity, no candles beyond those you made yourself, no glass in the windows, no windows at all. Just the opening of a shelter, or the entrance to a cave, or the edge of a hide tent. And beyond that opening, darkness so complete that you could hold your hand in front of your face and see nothing. This was the night that shaped human sleep. And it was long. Depending on the season and where in the world you lived, true darkness could last anywhere from 10 to 14 hours. In winter, in northern latitudes, even longer. The sun would sink below the horizon in the late afternoon. It wouldn't return for 12 hours or more. And in between, there was no option to stay occupied with screens or books lit by electric lamps, or the dull comfort of late-night television. There was just darkness and fire, if you were lucky enough to have it, and the sounds of the night outside. Modern sleep researchers have a name for the condition that existed before electricity changed everything. They call it bimodal sleep. Two distinct periods of sleep separated by a period of waking. And for most of human history, this was the default state of the human body left to its own devices. But here's what's remarkable. We didn't discover this by finding ancient caves with two separate sleeping areas. We didn't find a prehistoric tablet that said, "Humans sleep in 2 shifts." We found it by accident through a sleep experiment that changed the way scientists think about rest forever. In the early 1990s, a researcher named Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States wanted to understand how human sleep might have worked before artificial light existed. So he ran a simple but remarkable experiment. He took a group of volunteers and removed all artificial light from their lives. No bulbs, no screens. Just natural light during the day and total darkness for 14 hours each night. He expected them to settle into one long continuous sleep. That's not what happened. After a few weeks of adjusting, the volunteers started doing something unexpected. They fell asleep at the usual time. They slept for about 4 hours. Then they woke up. They stayed awake for an hour or two, lying quietly in the dark, calm and alert, and not distressed at all. And then they fell asleep again for another 4 hours. 2 sleeps. Every night. And the period in between, what Ware called the watch, or the wakeful period, was accompanied by something genuinely surprising. The volunteers' bodies, during that middle-of-the-night wakefulness, showed elevated levels of a hormone called prolactin, a hormone associated with a kind of deep, meditative calm, a relaxed, almost dreamy state. Not sleep, but not ordinary waking either. Something in between. Ware described it as a state of consciousness, unlike anything most modern people ever experience. A quiet, unhurried awareness in the deep of the night. And when he started looking for this pattern in historical records, he found it everywhere. What history forgot to tell us. The word that unlocks this whole story is first sleep. It appears in places so old and so ordinary that historians had been reading past it for decades without understanding what it meant. Roger E. Kirch is a historian at Virginia Tech University in the United States. He spent 16 years combing through historical documents, diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature. He was looking for references to how people slept in the centuries before electricity. And what he found transformed our understanding of human rest entirely. The references to first sleep appear casually, naturally, in texts from ancient Greece and Rome. They appear in medieval European documents, in the writings of African travelers, in Native American oral traditions, in the private journals of farmers and monks and sailors and noble women across centuries and continents. Nobody in any of these texts treats first sleep as unusual. Nobody explains what it is. They just mention it, the way you might casually mention breakfast or sunset, as though everyone reading already knows exactly what it means. Because everyone did. Here is Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the 1300s, referring to a character who wakes up after his first sleep. Here is a medical text from the 1500s, advising that the best time for a married couple to conceive is after first sleep, when both partners are refreshed and alert from their midnight waking. Here is a French document from the 1600s describing how workers in the city would wake after their first sleep, lie quietly for an hour, and then return to rest. Here is a diary entry from a colonial American describing how, on a cold January night, he woke after first sleep, thought about a problem he had been working on, found a solution, and then slept peacefully until morning. Over and over, across centuries, across languages, across cultures. First sleep, second sleep, and the quiet hour in between. Ekirch found over 500 references to this pattern in historical documents before he stopped counting. The evidence wasn't just abundant, it was universal. This was not a niche habit of a few unusual people. This was how humans slept. And the more he looked, the more he understood that the time between first and second sleep was not just an inconvenient gap. It was something people valued, protected, and used. The watch hour. People called it different things in different times and places. The watch, the first waking, the midnight hour, the quiet time. In some religious traditions, it was considered the most sacred part of the night, a liminal space between one day and the next, when the barrier between the ordinary world and something larger felt thinner than usual. Medieval monks built their entire prayer schedule around it. They called it the nocturne, or the night office. They would go to sleep at dusk, wake around midnight, pray and sing psalms for an hour or two, and then return to their beds for second sleep until dawn. This was not seen as a burden. It was considered a gift, a time when the mind was clear and the world was quiet and God felt close. But monks weren't the only ones who found value in the wakeful hour. Writers and thinkers throughout history described it as their most creative time, the hour when ideas came freely, when problems untangled themselves, when the mind could move without the friction of daily demands. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author who wrote Treasure Island and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, wrote about receiving entire stories in his mind during his nighttime wakings. He described a half-dreaming, half-waking state in which his imagination was unusually vivid and loose. He called this liminal space the theatre of the mind. And he wasn't alone. Many artists and writers throughout history have described this midnight threshold as a place of unusual mental freedom. Think about what that means. For most of human history, there was a built-in period of calm mental alertness in the middle of every night. Not groggy confusion, not anxious restlessness. A different kind of consciousness. Quiet, open, creative. And then we lost it. The story of how that happened is a story about light. When the night grew shorter. For most of human existence, the night was long, dark, and absolute. The only light available was fire. And fire, beautiful and warm as it is, cannot push back the dark the way electricity can. A candle or a hearth throws light in a small circle. Beyond that circle, the world remains dark. This meant that for most of human history, there was simply nothing to do in the deepest parts of the night that required light. You could talk, you could think, you could lie close to someone you loved, you could listen to the sounds of the night outside and the breathing of the people sleeping near you. But you could not read, you could not work, You could not chase away the darkness the way we do now. And because you could not do any of those things, your body adapted to the darkness rather than fighting it. It surrendered to the long night. It learned to break sleep into two gentle halves, with a quiet space in between to rest in a different way. But then, slowly, the night began to shrink. The change didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, almost invisible, unfolding over centuries. Candles became more affordable in the 1600s and 1700s. Streets in European cities began to be lit with lanterns. Coffee shops and taverns stayed open late, lit by dozens of flickering flames. The night was still dark, but it was becoming less so. And as the night began to lighten, people began to resist sleep. They began to fight against the body's ancient desire to retire at dusk and rise with the dawn. They began to stay up later, socializing and reading and working by candlelight. And as they began to stay up later, something shifted. When you stay up until 10 or 11 at night, rather than retiring at 8, you compress the available sleeping hours. You have less time in bed. And a body with less time in bed tends to consolidate its sleep into one continuous block, rather than two shorter ones with a gap in between. The two sleeps began to merge. By the 1800s, references to first sleep in European documents had nearly vanished. The phrase that had appeared so casually and commonly for centuries was fading from the historical record. And then electricity arrived. Thomas Edison's electric light bulb, perfected in 1879, changed everything. Not immediately, not overnight, but within a few decades, electric light was spreading through cities and towns across Europe and America. The night, for the first time in human history, could be genuinely eliminated. You could fill a room with light so bright that your body genuinely could not tell whether it was day or night. And the last traces of the old two-sleep pattern dissolved. By the early 20th century, the idea that healthy sleep meant one continuous block of 7 or 8 hours had become so firmly established that nobody even questioned it. It felt like a biological law, as fixed and natural as breathing. But it wasn't a biological law. It was an accident of history. It was what happens to human sleep when you fill the night with electric light and compress the available hours of darkness until the body has no choice but to consolidate everything into one long stretch. The two-sleep pattern hadn't disappeared from human biology. It had just been suppressed. What your body still remembers here is something that might shift how you think about your own nights. That 3 a.m. waking that leaves you staring at the ceiling, heart beating a little fast, mind churning. In another era, that would have been the watch hour. That half-awake, half-dreaming state you sometimes fall into, where thoughts feel loose and creative, and your normal worries seem oddly distant. That was the prolactin state that Thomas Wehr documented in his experiment. That was the thing medieval monks built their nights around. Your body hasn't forgotten. Underneath all the modern expectations about what sleep is supposed to look like, the ancient rhythm is still there, still trying to assert itself, still waking you up at midnight because for thousands of years, midnight waking was completely normal. The anxiety people feel about nighttime waking is, in a way, a modern invention. When people in the medieval period woke after first sleep, they didn't lie there worrying about the fact that they were awake. They didn't run through the mental calculation of how many hours they had left before the alarm went off. They didn't catastrophize about what would happen if they couldn't get back to sleep. They just woke up. They used the time. And then they slept again. The suffering of modern nighttime waking is not caused by the waking itself. It's caused by the belief that we shouldn't be waking at all. And that belief, that expectation of consolidated, uninterrupted sleep, is barely 150 years old. Eckhart makes this point quietly but powerfully. He suggests that what doctors now call sleep maintenance insomnia, waking in the middle of the night and struggling to get back to sleep, might in many cases not be a disorder at all. It might be an ancient rhythm that the modern world has nowhere to put. Think about that for a moment. The problem isn't the waking. The problem is that we no longer have a practice for it. We no longer have the monk's prayer, the medieval bedside journal, the quiet conversation in the dark, the simple permission to lie awake for a while without judging it. We wake up and immediately start fighting the wakefulness. And fighting the wakefulness makes it worse. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we talk about what this means for how we live now, we need to understand something deeper. What was actually happening to the human mind during that ancient wakeful hour? What was the night really for? The dreaming room. There is a theory, still debated, still beautiful, that the time between first and second sleep was when the human mind did some of its most important work. Not the work of planning or solving practical problems, though that happened too. The deeper work. The work of making sense of things. During the first sleep, the brain processes the events of the day. It sorts through memories. It decides what to keep and what to release. This is one of the established functions of sleep that researchers have documented in detail. The brain uses sleep for memory consolidation, emotional processing, and the filing away of experience. But the shift between first and second sleep, that quiet hour of midnight waking, may have served a different function. A kind of review, a sitting with. People in historical records describe the watch hour as a time of unusual mental clarity. Not the sharpness of morning alertness, which is focused and task-oriented. Something quieter, more diffuse, more willing to let associations form without forcing them. In this state, the mind could hold two things at once without conflict: a worry and a comfort, a question and an acceptance of not yet knowing the answer, a grief and a gratitude. The brain's default mode network, which activates during rest and mind wandering, is associated with this kind of diffuse, associative thinking. And there is evidence that this network is particularly active during the transition between sleep stages, exactly the kind of half-awake, half-asleep state that characterizes the watch hour. In simpler terms, the brain does a particular kind of thinking in the middle of the night that it doesn't do at any other time. And for thousands of years, humans gave it the space to do that thinking. Not because they understood the neuroscience, they didn't, but because the long dark night forced them to lie still in the quiet. And in the quiet, the mind did what minds do when they aren't being pushed around. It found its own way. Dreams played a central role in this. The second sleep, the one that follows the wakeful hour, is thought to be particularly rich in REM sleep, the stage of sleep associated with vivid dreaming, emotional processing, and creative connection-making. By staying awake for an hour and allowing the brain to rest in a half-conscious state before returning to sleep, people may have been setting the stage for deeper, more powerful dreaming in their second sleep. The dreams of the watch hour were considered meaningful across many cultures. In ancient Mesopotamia, dream interpretation was a formal practice. Tablets have been found listing the meanings of different types of dreams. But there were specific instructions about which dreams were most reliable. Those that came in the second half of the night were considered more truthful, more connected to divine guidance than dreams that came in the first sleep. In ancient Egypt, temples were built where the sick would come to sleep with the intention of receiving healing dreams. The priests who managed these temples understood that the most powerful dreams came not at the beginning of the night, but in that deeper, darker, quieter second sleep that followed the midnight waking. In the Hebrew Bible, many of the most significant divine communications come in dreams at night, and the way these accounts are structured suggests an awareness of the night as divided, with the deepest messages arriving not at first sleep, but in the second, richer darkness. The ancient world didn't have neuroscience, but it understood in its own language that something important happened in the deep of the night, something that required stillness and time and a willingness to lie in the dark without hurrying back to wakefulness. Fire and stars and the sound of each other breathing. Let's step back from the science for a moment and just imagine it. You are lying in a shelter 10,000 years ago. Outside, the night is absolute. The fire has burned down to low coals that glow orange in the darkness. You are not alone. There are other people in this shelter with you, maybe 15 or 20. Your small band, your extended family, your whole world. You fell asleep not long after the sun went down. The fire was still bright then, and someone told a story, and children drifted off first, as they always do, and then the adults one by one. Now you are awake. The fire needs feeding. Someone is already doing it, one of the older members of the group who sleeps lighter and whose job it partly is to keep the fire through the night. You can see their shape in the low light, moving quietly, adding wood, settling back. You lie still and listen. Outside, you can hear the night, the insects, a distant animal call, wind in the trees if there are trees, the sound of the land breathing. Inside, you can hear the people around you, the soft, slow breathing of sleep, a child making a small sound and settling again, the shift and rustle of someone else who is also awake, lying still, thinking their thoughts in the dark. You don't feel frightened. This is how every night has been. This is normal. The first sleep is done, and now is the time between. The watch hour, the quiet time. Your mind is loose and clear in a way it isn't during the day. During the day, there is always something to do, somewhere to be, something that needs your attention right now. But in this still darkness, there is nothing that needs doing. Nowhere to go, nothing to fix. You think about the conversation that happened yesterday that didn't feel quite right. You turn it over. You understand it differently now, here in the dark, with no pressure to respond or react. You think about the hunt planned for tomorrow, but not with anxiety, more like an idle, soft consideration. The route, the likely behavior of the animals, the way the wind will be moving. You think about the person sleeping next to you. You feel, without urgency, a warmth toward them. The coals shift, sparks rise and fade. Outside, the stars are very bright. You look at them for a while, not naming them or tracking their movements, Though you know these things too, just looking. The way you might look at something beautiful without needing to do anything about it. And then, slowly, without deciding to, you close your eyes again. The second sleep comes differently than the first. Not like falling, the way the first sleep sometimes feels. More like sinking, like being gently, slowly covered by something warm and dark. And the dreams come, rich and strange and vivid. People from your past, landscapes you've never seen, images that don't mean anything in words but feel deeply significant when you're inside them. And you sleep until the first grey light comes through the opening of the shelter. The biology of the long night. Thomas Wehr's experiment in the 1990s didn't just reveal that humans sleep in 2 phases when given enough darkness. It revealed why. And the answer is a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is sometimes called the darkness hormone. Your body starts producing it when light levels drop, signaling that it's time to sleep. But it doesn't just switch on and off cleanly. It builds gradually in waves. In Wehr's experiment, the volunteers who switched to 2 sleeps showed a distinctive pattern of melatonin production. The hormone rose steeply in the early evening, triggering the first sleep. It then leveled off during the midnight waking period. And then it rose again slightly before the second sleep. This double wave pattern is what creates the natural 2-sleep architecture. But here is the crucial part. Artificial light suppresses melatonin production. Even relatively dim indoor lighting, the kind you might have in your living room at night, can suppress melatonin by 20 to 50% compared to darkness. When you are exposed to artificial light in the evening, your brain doesn't get the melatonin signal that says it's time for the body to enter its long night mode. The wave pattern that produces 2-sleep architecture is flattened. Your body consolidates its sleep into a single shorter block because it never receives the full darkness signal that tells it the night is going to be very long. You don't lose the biological capacity for 2 sleeps. The underlying rhythm is still there, encoded in your hormonal system and your circadian biology. You just suppress it every night with your lights and your screens. This is why Wehr's volunteers needed several weeks to adjust. Their bodies were slowly clearing the accumulated effects of decades of artificial light exposure. They were slowly rediscovering what their biology wanted to do when the night was genuinely dark. And what their biology wanted to do, it turned out, was exactly what humans had done for thousands of years. Sleep in 2 halves, wake in between. Return to sleep. There is something both simple and profound about this finding. The body isn't broken. The body isn't confused. The body is trying to follow a pattern that worked for almost all of human history. But the environment we've built for ourselves no longer supports that pattern. We have lit up the night. And in lighting up the night, we have accidentally compressed our sleep into a shape it was never quite designed to take. The monks who mapped the dark. The most elaborate and intentional human engagement with the 2-sleep pattern was probably the monastic tradition. Across different religions and different centuries, communities of monks and nuns developed detailed sleep schedules that built the midnight waking into the structure of the entire day. The Christian monastic tradition, as it developed through figures like Saint Benedict in the 6th century, organized the day around what were called the canonical hours, fixed times for prayer spread throughout the day and night. The most important of the nighttime hours was called matins, or vigils. And in early monastic communities, it was set specifically at the natural midnight waking point. Benedict's rule, the foundational text of Western monasticism, gives detailed instructions about matins. The monks should sleep after Compline, the final evening prayer. They should wake in the middle of the night for vigils, a sustained period of prayer, psalm singing, and scriptural reading. And then they should return to sleep until dawn. What's remarkable is that Benedict explicitly acknowledges the difficulty of rising in the middle of the night. He suggests strategies. The brothers should encourage each other. The abbot should set a good example. The sleepy should be gently woken rather than startled. These instructions only make sense if the monks were working against a natural human tendency to stay asleep through the night. But they're not working against a natural tendency at all. They're working with one. The midnight waking in Benedict's system was not an arbitrary imposition. It was a spiritual framework built around a biological reality. The monks knew, even without understanding why, that the middle of the night was a distinct kind of time, a time of unusual stillness and unusual clarity. They organized their entire lives around it. And they weren't alone. In Islamic tradition, there is a practice called tahajjud, voluntary night prayer performed after waking from sleep. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded as strongly encouraging this practice, describing the time between midnight and dawn as particularly auspicious for prayer and spiritual reflection. The tradition explicitly involves sleeping first, waking in the deep of the night, praying, and then returning to sleep. In the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, a practice called Tikkun Chatzot involves rising at midnight for a special prayer and meditation. The midnight hour is described in mystical texts as a time when divine presence is particularly close and accessible. In Buddhist communities across Asia, monks have traditionally observed a sleep schedule that involves a period of waking practice in the deep of the night, followed by sleep until dawn. Across these different traditions, across different centuries and different continents and different theological frameworks, the same pattern appears. Sleep. Wake at midnight. Use the wakeful hour for the most important inner work. Sleep again until dawn. These traditions didn't invent the two-sleep pattern. They found it in the body and built practices around it. They understood that the middle of the night was not empty time to be hurried through. It was time of a different quality, time that the ordinary day could not replicate, and they treated it as precious. What the body does when we sleep wrong. Here is a slightly uncomfortable thing. The modern 8-hour sleep, the kind that doctors and sleep researchers have been recommending for decades, might not be the natural human default, and the consequences of forcing our bodies into that pattern, of compressing everything into a single consolidated block by lighting up the night and staying awake until late, might be part of the reason so many people feel so tired all the time. Let's be careful here. This isn't a claim that modern sleep is causing catastrophic harm. Sleep science is complicated, and the research on this is still developing. But here are some things we do know. We know that sleep deprivation is genuinely widespread. Studies consistently find that large percentages of adults in industrialized countries are not getting enough sleep. People report feeling chronically tired, difficulty concentrating, emotional fragility, a persistent fog that lifts somewhat with caffeine but never quite clears. We know that the structure of sleep matters, not just the total hours. Different stages of sleep serve different functions. REM sleep, rich in dreaming, is essential for emotional processing and creative thinking. Deep, slow-wave sleep is essential for physical restoration and memory consolidation. When sleep is disrupted, when its architecture is distorted, we miss out on specific benefits, even if the total hours look adequate. We know that the hours of sleep matter. The body has strong preferences about when it sleeps relative to the cycles of light and dark. Fighting those preferences by staying up very late or waking very early has real costs. And we know from Wehr's experiment and from the historical record that the natural human sleep pattern, when humans are given enough darkness and no artificial light, is not one continuous 8-hour block. It's 2 shorter periods with a quiet space in between. So, what happens when you force a body with a 2-sleep rhythm into a consolidated 8-hour block? In many cases, the body keeps trying to insert its natural wakeful period anyway. That 3 in the morning waking. That hour of lying awake in the middle of the night, mind moving in unusual ways, unable to force itself back to sleep. This is not necessarily a malfunction. It might be the ancient rhythm asserting itself. It might be the body asking for something the modern world doesn't know how to give it. A little while in the dark. Just awake, just being. Not scrolling through your phone. Not replaying tomorrow's anxieties. Not calculating how many hours you have left. Just lying in the quiet of the night, letting your mind do whatever it does in that strange, still, prolactin-rich hour between first sleep and second sleep. The thing it did for 10,000 years, before we lit up the dark. Reading the stars from bed. There is a medieval English poem, anonymous, written somewhere around the year 1300, that describes a character lying awake between his 2 sleeps. The poem is about insomnia, or what the writer thinks of as insomnia. The character is frustrated that he cannot sleep continuously through the night. He considers various remedies. He recites prayers. He counts his blessings. He tries to think pleasant thoughts. And here's the thing that makes this poem so interesting to historians. The character doesn't describe lying awake between 2 sleeps as normal. He describes it as something wrong with him, which suggests that even by the year 1300, in an era when most people still observed the 2-sleep pattern without thinking much about it, some people were already beginning to develop the expectation that sleep should be continuous. The medicalization of nighttime waking had already begun, faintly at the edges. By the 1800s, that expectation had hardened into something like medical doctrine. The influential 19th century doctor Nathaniel Kleitman, sometimes called the father of modern sleep research, promoted the idea of consolidated 8-hour sleep as the healthy norm. His work was enormously influential, and while his contributions to understanding sleep were real and important, his framing of sleep as a single continuous block became so dominant that it essentially erased the possibility of the 2-sleep pattern from medical consciousness. When patients came to doctors complaining of waking in the middle of the night, the doctors heard, insomnia, disorder, problem to be solved. Nobody said, that's normal. You're fine. Your body is trying to do something it's been doing for thousands of years. Just lie there quietly for a bit, and you'll sleep again. Instead, they prescribed things to make people sleep through the night without waking. They prescribed the suppression of an ancient rhythm, and the rhythm went underground. Not gone, not truly eliminated, just pressed down, forced into compliance, renamed as a disorder rather than understood as an inheritance. Kirch argues carefully that this medicalization of the nighttime waking, this insistence on consolidated, uninterrupted sleep as the only healthy standard, has created a kind of collective suffering that didn't need to exist. Not all nighttime waking is anxiety and disorder. Some of it is the body doing exactly what bodies have always done in the long dark of the night. Waking for a while, being quietly awake in the world, and then, in its own time, returning to sleep. The night belongs to you. Let's slow down now. Let's breathe. You are lying somewhere dark right now, or almost dark. Maybe there's the glow of a streetlight behind the curtain. Maybe a nightlight in the hallway. Maybe your phone on its lowest setting. But you are horizontal, and the day is behind you. And you are listening to a story about how humans spent their nights before the modern world decided what sleep was supposed to look like. And maybe some part of you recognizes this, not as a new idea, as a familiar one, because you have been in that state before, that place between first sleep and second sleep that has no good name in modern English, that quiet, lucid, slightly dreamy wakefulness in the deep of the night. You know what it feels like. The way thoughts move differently then. Not the urgent, tangled thoughts of daytime worry. Something slower, more willing to rest with uncertainty, more capable of holding a question without immediately demanding an answer. There is something in that state that the waking mind cannot quite reach, and there is something in that state that the sleeping mind cannot quite reach either. It lives in the gap. The medieval monks knew it. They sang in it. The ancient Egyptians knew it. They sent their sick to sleep in temples, waiting for the dreaming gifts that came in a second sleep. The hunter-gatherer, lying near the cooling fire 10,000 years ago, knew it. He stared at the stars and thought thoughts that needed the dark. And your body knows it too, even now, even suppressed under fluorescent lights and late-night entertainment and the relentless glow of screens. The rhythm is still there. If you let the night be dark enough, long enough, quiet enough, your body will find its way back to it. Learning to live in two halves. There is a quiet revolution happening in how some sleep researchers and therapists think about nighttime waking. Not all of them. Not yet mainstream, but enough to suggest that the conversation is changing. Some therapists working with people who have sleep problems have begun to offer an unusual suggestion. Stop fighting the waking. When you wake in the middle of the night, don't immediately reach for your phone. Don't start calculating how many hours you have left. Don't turn on a light. Just lie there. Let the wakefulness be what it is. Notice what your mind does when you stop fighting it. Notice how the thoughts move in that hour. Notice whether the anxiety you associate with nighttime waking might actually be the anxiety about nighttime waking rather than the waking itself. What would happen if the waking was just allowed? What would you think about in that quiet hour? What would you notice about your life, your relationships, your inner landscape, when you gave your mind 60 minutes in the dark with no agenda and no demands? Some people who try this report something unexpected. The night stops feeling like a problem. It starts feeling like a different kind of time. Not wasted time, not broken time. Time with a different quality, a different pace, a different kind of value. The watch hour. The time between. The ancient middle of the night that humans once used for prayer and thought and quiet conversation. and simply being alive in the world in the dark. There is, of course, a real difference between this and genuine insomnia, which is a clinical condition that causes real suffering and is sometimes improved by cognitive behavioral therapy and other interventions. Not every nighttime waking is benign. Not every sleep disruption should be accepted without examination. But there is also a real difference between clinical insomnia and the ordinary experience of waking in the middle of the night, lying quietly for a while, and returning to sleep. The second thing, the ordinary human thing, the 10,000-year-old normal thing, does not need fixing. It needs space. It needs permission. It needs the understanding that the human body was not built for 8 uninterrupted hours of unconsciousness. It was built for 2 softer halves of sleep, with a small, still, luminous gap in between. What the dark does to the mind. Here is something researchers have found that deserves more attention than it gets. The brain during the natural midnight waking period, the prolactin-rich, half-drowsy state that Ver documented, shows a pattern of neural activity that is distinctly different from normal waking and also distinctly different from sleep. It is sometimes compared to the brain state associated with meditation. Not the active, focused kind of meditation where you are carefully watching your breath and returning your attention when it wanders. More like the diffuse, receptive kind, where you are simply present without directing your attention anywhere in particular. Open, available, quiet. In this state, the default mode network is highly active. This is the network associated with mind-wandering, self-reflection, creative association, and what researchers call autobiographical thinking, the brain's way of weaving a story about who you are and what your life means. This is the part of the brain that integrates experience. That takes the raw material of what happened during the day and begins to make meaning of it. That connects new experiences to old memories, identifies patterns, resolves emotional residues that the waking mind was too busy to process. We do this kind of processing during REM sleep as well. But the midnight waking seems to offer something slightly different. A semi-conscious integration. A chance to do some of the work of meaning-making while still partly awake. People throughout history described the watch hour as a time of unusual insight. Not the sharp, analytical insight of problem-solving, but the softer, deeper insight of understanding. Why did I feel that way? What does that relationship really mean to me? What am I afraid of, actually, underneath all the surface concerns? What matters most to me when I strip away all the noise? The quiet of the night has a particular way of cutting through. And the biology suggests this isn't just romantic notion. The brain in that state really is doing something different. Something that the busy daytime mind cannot do, and the deeply sleeping mind cannot do either. Something that requires the dark, and the stillness, and the time between. The night of the long-distance runner. Here is a detail that tends to stop people when they hear it. In Ver's sleep experiment, the volunteers who switched to 2 sleep patterns didn't just experience a change in when they woke up. They reported feeling better, more rested, despite sleeping in total fewer hours than many of them had before. Less groggy in the mornings, more emotionally even, less anxious. This is counterintuitive if you believe that sleep is simply about accumulating hours. More hours should mean more rest. But the relationship between sleep and well-being isn't just about quantity, It's about structure, timing, rhythm. A body sleeping in two natural halves with a quiet space between in deep darkness, in alignment with its melatonin rhythms, may actually rest more deeply and restore more completely than a body crammed into 8 compressed hours after an evening of artificial light. The volunteers also reported, almost universally, that the wakeful period between their sleeps was peaceful, not anxious, not restless, just quiet. They didn't want to do anything. They didn't feel the urge to scroll or check messages or fill the time with distraction. They just lay in the dark, in that half-dreaming state, and felt, as one participant described it, deeply okay. Deeply okay. That phrase has stayed with researchers who read Wehr's paper, because it points to something that many people in the modern world rarely feel, especially at night. The sense that the night is not a problem, that the dark is not threatening, that the body's rhythms are trustworthy and don't need to be fought, that you can lie in the middle of the night, awake, and simply be. Okay, the children and the fire. Before we come back to the present, let's spend a little more time in the past. Because the two-sleep pattern wasn't just a fact about how adults slept. It organized the entire texture of the night for whole communities. Imagine a small village or a band of nomadic people in a world without electric light. The night is long and dark. Everyone has gone to sleep after dusk. The fire is tended by whoever is keeping watch, sometimes an older person, sometimes a young adult taking a turn. When people wake after first sleep, they don't wake into silence. They wake into a small, gentle community of other wakeful people. Not everyone wakes at exactly the same time, of course. But enough people are awake during the natural midnight waking period that the hour has a social quality to it. Low conversations, the kind that only happen in the dark, the kind where you say things that are harder to say in the brightness of the day. In historical records, Ikirch found references to people doing particular kinds of talking during the watch hour. Couples talking after first sleep. Not the practical talk of the day, not the negotiation of tasks and responsibilities and plans. Deeper talk. The kind that requires quiet and darkness, and a sense of time standing slightly still. Confessions of fear, expressions of love, working through conflicts that the busy daytime had left unresolved. There is something about the middle of the night that makes honesty easier. The dark takes away the social performance that daylight requires. The masks people wear, the careful management of how they appear, all of that softens in the dark. What's left is something more essential. And for thousands of years, the watch hour was when couples had that kind of conversation. Not because they planned to, because the night made it available. Children who woke during this hour would find adults nearby, awake, available. Not hurried or distracted, just present in the dark. Ready to comfort a frightened child, ready to answer a question, ready to pull a small body close and let it feel the warmth of safety. The two-sleep pattern created a kind of nocturnal village life that we have completely lost. Not a dramatic, eventful village life. Quiet, small, ordinary. Just humans, awake together in the dark for a little while before sleep came again. The last fires. There is a place in the human nervous system that remembers all of this, not as words or images or memories, as a feeling. The feeling of lying awake in the deep of the night and not being afraid. The feeling of the dark as a presence rather than an absence. The feeling of your mind moving slowly and freely through thoughts that don't need to go anywhere. This feeling has been suppressed in most modern lives by the constant availability of light and stimulation and distraction. But it hasn't been eliminated. Every time you wake at 3 in the morning and lie still instead of reaching for your phone, you are briefly in contact with it. Every time you let the darkness just be darkness and let your mind wander wherever it wants to wander, you are briefly in contact with it. Every time you notice that your sleeping mind occasionally does something useful, that a problem you were struggling with the day before is somehow clearer in the morning, that a feeling you couldn't name has resolved itself overnight into something you can understand, you are experiencing the fruits of it. The 2 sleep pattern isn't just a historical curiosity. It's an ongoing conversation between your ancient body and the long dark night. A conversation that the modern world has made very difficult to have, but that the body keeps trying to start. Every time the lights go off and the darkness settles in, and the hours of the night stretch out before you. Every time you wake in the small hours and find yourself briefly, gently, unusually awake. Where we are now, sleep research is changing. Slowly, but it is changing. More researchers are taking seriously the idea that consolidated 8-hour sleep might not be the only or even the ideal form for human rest. There is growing interest in the relationship between circadian rhythms and mental health, with studies suggesting that misalignment between light exposure, sleep timing, and the body's natural melatonin rhythms is associated with higher rates of anxiety and depression. There is growing recognition that the way most people in industrialized countries sleep, compressed into a single block after an evening of bright artificial light, might not be serving us as well as we assume. There are sleep therapists experimenting with approaches that work with the body's natural midnight waking tendency rather than against it, helping people develop practices for the watch hour rather than strategies to suppress it. And there is a growing conversation in both scientific and popular culture about what it means to live a life that is genuinely aligned with the body's rhythms rather than constantly fighting them. This conversation touches on more than sleep. It touches on everything: the pace of the day, the management of light and darkness, the design of work and rest, the quality of attention we bring to the hours between sunset and sunrise. For most of human history, the night was treated as a distinct and valuable time, not empty, not something to be eliminated by light or entertainment. A time with its own qualities, its own kind of consciousness, its own gifts. We lit it up, and in lighting it up, we lost something. Not catastrophically, not irreversibly, but quietly, gradually, in the way things are lost when you stop noticing them. The watch hour is still there, inside every body that still carries the old rhythm, inside every person who wakes in the dark and finds their mind unusually still and clear. It's waiting. Coming home to the dark, here's what I want to leave you with. As the story settles and your breathing slows, you are made of a long history. Your body knows things your mind has forgotten. It knows how to find food in seasons of scarcity. It knows how to walk for miles without tiring. It knows how to recognize safe water and dangerous plants, and the sounds of the night that mean something is approaching. And it knows how to sleep. Not the compressed, anxious, alarm clock sleep of modern life. The real sleep, the old sleep, the kind that comes in two gentle halves, with a quiet space between, where the mind rests in a different way, where the dark does its work. Your ancestors slept this way, in caves and shelters, and hide tents, and stone houses, and wooden longhouses, and all the variations of human dwelling across 10,000 years. They woke in the middle of the night and lay in the dark, and thought their thoughts, and said their quiet things to the people lying close to them. They watched the coals of fires that have long since gone cold. They looked at stars through openings in roofs and walls and the gaps between tree branches. And then they slept again. Rich, deep, dreaming second sleep until dawn. That rhythm lives in you, even now in whatever room you are in, wherever in the world you happen to be lying down tonight, even under the artificial light, even under the weight of modern expectations about what sleep is supposed to look like. Your body is still trying to follow the ancient pattern, still trying to give you the watch hour, still trying to give you the second sleep, still trying to give you the deep, restorative darkness that human bodies were shaped to need. So, if tonight you find yourself awake in the middle of the night, don't fight it. Don't reach for your phone. Don't start counting hours. Don't decide that something is wrong. Just lie there. Let your mind go where it wants to go. Let the dark be dark. Let the night be long. And when sleep comes again, let it come. The second sleep, soft and deep and full of the kind of dreaming that used to be considered a gift. You have inherited all of this. The long nights of your ancestors, the watchfires, the quiet conversations in the dark, the way the mind moves in that particular hour between first sleep and second, between one kind of darkness and another. It is all still in you, and tonight, as you drift, as the story ends and the silence opens up, you can let it all rest. Your body knows what to do. It always has. If this quiet journey helped you towards sleep tonight, you can tap the like button softly and subscribe, so there are more of these stories waiting for you whenever you need them. A kind word in the comments. If you find yourself awake and want to leave one, always means something. Tell me where you are in the world, what time it is, what the night sounds like from where you're lying. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. No alarm to check, no schedule to keep, no version of sleep you need to perform. Just the dark and your breathing, and the ancient, patient rhythm of a body that knows how rest is done. The fire is low, the stars are bright. First sleep is finished, and the second sleep is coming. Let it come.